I want to welcome our congressional panel next. Please come join us. David Leonhardt is going to moderate it. David, welcome back. And we're delighted to have Congressman Jim Hines, Congressman Bryan Steil, a Hoyer, I have to mention that, and Congressman Lawler. So, David, take it away.
Thank you so much. Good to see you all again. We're saving the best for last. 3 members of the United States Congress. Thank you all for joining us. So we're going to start broad, then we're going to talk a little bit about financial markets, and then actually we're going to kind of lift up and talk about the state of the world, because you don't always get 3 members of Congress in one place. And we were having a really good conversation in the green room before. We're going to talk a little about American politics. We're going to talk a little bit about the Middle East and take advantage of having these folks here. So let's start with kind of the big broad question of the American economy. And Congressman Lawler, I'll start with you, and then go down. A lot of people are frustrated today. A lot of people feel like the American economy isn't serving them well. When there's a Democratic president, Republican voters tend to be angry, or vice versa. But basically, a lot of Americans have been unhappy for most of the 21st century. How do you think about this? Why is the American economy not delivering results that most people feel satisfied with?
Because I think we tend to get caught up on the wrong issues. To me, when you look at our economy, we have over 6 million units underbuilt in this country in terms of housing. So when you talk about housing affordability, part of it is a supply issue. When you look at energy, we have a horrifically bad energy policy in this country. In New York State, where I represent the 17th Congressional District of New York, for instance, 70% of New Yorkers rely on natural gas. 70% of electricity is generated by natural gas, and yet we're trying to prohibit the use of natural gas. And so energy costs go up. You look at government spending, it's reckless. In New York State, they've increased spending by $50 billion in 3 years. It's unsustainable. They now have a nearly $6 billion budget deficit heading into next year. They're looking at a $36 billion revenue shortfall. They lead the nation in out-migration. So it really comes down to the policies. And I think if we want to have a more robust economy that is focused on affordability, that's focused on employment, that's focused on wages, then we need to allow for the private sector to flourish. We need to allow for the free markets to work. And that really revolves around having a coherent energy policy, a strong housing plan, an immigration policy that works, and really allowing our financial markets and institutions to flourish. We need regulation, but we cannot stifle the innovation and the opportunity. And so I think part of it really, in my estimation, and just in being in Congress for the last 10 months, I think a lot of the things we focus on are not the issues that actually will resolve the economic challenges that we face.
So, Congressman Hines, my guess is we get some bipartisan agreement from you there and maybe some bipartisan disagreement from you there. What do you see as the fundamental issues that are keeping our economy from doing what it could?
Yeah, I think I would agree with a lot of what Mike said. I'd disagree on a couple of points, but I think what Mike didn't say is that the American household has been through just a brutal 20 years, or let's say 15, right? So 2008, the crisis of 2008, $17 trillion of household wealth has evaporated. That's bad enough in and of itself as an objective matter, but what does America see at the time? In 2008, what they see at the time is that a bunch of financial products that they don't understand, collateralized mortgage obligations, traded in ways they don't understand by firms that they don't really know much about, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, that tanks their economy, zeroes out their 401k, makes it impossible for them to pay their mortgage, huge unemployment. And then they see the Congress engineered this, thank God, the year before I got here, a bailout. We bailed out the firms that were at the core of that problem. That is not just terrible economically, but in terms of sentiment. I trace a lot of the populism that is in this country to that moment where Americans said, wait a minute, The government isn't looking out for me. They're looking out for J.P. Morgan and Morgan Stanley. So there's that. And that's, of course, on the heels of the Iraq War. Then we have the pandemic. There's just the American consumer has been through an immense amount of pain. Underneath that, tectonically, I think people think about their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives. Look back to 1950. Right? Unionization made sure that there were, in the industrial Midwest, you'd leave high school and you'd get a union job down at the plant and you were middle class, right? You didn't need to go to college. That world is largely gone. Now, the economy is changing and being disrupted, as the sort of venture capitalist community likes to say, so rapidly, so much less secure. And so I just think there's a lot of both tectonic and more short-term things that have created a lot of pain for the American consumer. Mike's not wrong about the deficit or about energy prices. I mean, somebody probably has the idea to forbid natural gas. The reality is the United States is producing far more oil and natural gas today than it ever has, and energy prices go up and down. The debt and the deficit are a serious issue that we have not yet felt, right? The way we're going to feel that is when interest rates rise. Now, interest rates have risen, but they've risen as a deliberate choice of monetary policy. So I wouldn't say that he's wrong about that. I'm just saying that, the deficit, in the 15 years I've been in Congress, everybody has been saying, this is the year that the United States collapses because of our debt and deficit. And it turns out this is not the year.
Yeah. Well, it's fun. So in Congress, you may know this, that depending who controls the chamber, that party gets one or more than one extra seats on the committee. So on our panel here, since we have House members and Republicans control the House, the Republicans have the majority. So Congressman Steil, you get the last word. How do you see the big things holding back our economy?
So I'd take what we discussed. I think it's cost of living. But I'd also add in our media ecosystem. Let me hit cost of living first. We look at the drivers that are driving family budgets. The cost of going into a new home in 3 years has doubled. What I mean by that is home prices have risen and interest rates have risen. To purchase the median home 3 years ago, your mortgage was $1,200 a month. To purchase the median home today, it's doubled. It's now $2,400 a month, which actually says most people couldn't sell the home they live in to themselves, meaning you couldn't sell it at market rate and get a mortgage and pay your mortgage. That's problematic. Costs have gone up for energy. We could discuss why. Costs have gone up for childcare. We could have conversations, and Jim Himes and I served on a select committee on economic disparity and fairness and growth. I think we both reached the conclusion that childcare is a huge problem. We have divergent views in some ways on how to solve it, same way we may have on energy. But I think recognizing that these are real drivers of people's frustration, I think is real. And as policymakers, we have to find ways to address it. The other thing just to build quickly, is I think we also don't spend enough time thinking about how the media ecosystem has changed. I don't offer a solution to this, but I think it's worth recognizing. And I think back, we're about to go to Thanksgiving, and so I think about a family sitting down 55 years ago in my hometown of Janesville, Wisconsin. There's probably an uncle and a nephew screaming and yelling at each other about the issue of the day. Should we be in Vietnam? Right? Domino theory, draft deferments, was the Tet Offensive successful, not successful? And you can envision that debate in two people who could barely stand each other. But the night before, they probably both watched Walter Cronkite. In a week from tomorrow, there'll be families sitting down having Thanksgiving dinner, probably at the same family, at the same table, a generation and a half removed, that'll have a similar robust fight over some policy issue of the day. One will have watched a cable TV channel, and the other will have read their neighbor's Facebook page. And you laugh because you kind of know it's true. And the challenge, right, is that if you're not starting a policy debate from a similar set of facts, is uniquely challenging. And I combine the struggle families are facing with affording the things that they need. And I combine that with the media landscape that we have. And I think that's a unique challenge.
And so, that's such a fascinating point. Can we just spend another minute on it? Do any of you have thoughts about what can we do about that media landscape?
I would jump in. So I don't know that I don't have a silver bullet. I don't know that anybody does.
Yeah.
But I think we all have to recognize the challenges in a sense that social media has great benefits. It has great challenges. I don't offer a solution to it, but I think it's worth pausing and reflecting that everyone is now a publisher. I mean, you're with the New York Times. It wasn't that long ago that if you wanted to have information dispersed, there was a smaller number of individuals that controlled that mechanism. There's pros and cons to every system. It is now incredibly democratized. There's great positives to that. There's some challenges. And I think we're in this transition period as we become accustomed to anyone can post anything on X or on any other social media platform that you want. true or not true, right? Not vetted by an editor. There's benefits to that. There's challenges with that. So I don't offer a policy solution as much as I think it's worth all of us kind of pausing and reflecting that that is a significant issue that we face in the landscape.
I think you obviously have, all of us have our own biases, our own viewpoints, but we're living in a world of echo chambers, and everybody wants to hear something that affirms their perspective or point of view. And if somebody offers an opinion that is different than them, we immediately ascribe an adjective to them and demean their motivation or or their position, rather than engage in robust public debate. And I think, we talk a lot, and certainly on universities, there's a lot of focus on diversity and the need to respect diversity. But we don't respect diversity of thought anymore. And that is a big problem, because you can't actually solve problems if you're not willing to engage in robust debate. And I think the media, frankly, has played a terrible role in this. I think, you can read almost any news article, and it's got a lot of opinion in it. It's got a lot of adjectives in it, rather than just statement of fact and action. And this is what this individual said or did. They ascribe an adjective to what this individual said or did. And I think that is destructive because it just layers on more biases as we're trying to work through these problems. And social media, I will tell you this as somebody who was in college when Facebook came out and really took off. If I am not in elected office, the first thing I will do is delete all of my social media accounts because it's destructive. I mean, you sit and read this nonsense every day. I have the same 20 people. I'm sure you have the same 20. That
might literally be the same 20.
sit and tell you what an awful human being you are on your social media accounts. But it's like, it's all drivel. It's all drivel.
I want to interject here because I have an unintuitive thing to say, as probably left of my friends here. I don't think there's a policy solution here. I don't, and you're going to hear this from a Democrat, which is I really, and in every town hall meeting I do. This is something for the American civic body, for American citizens to solve. I, as a Democrat, will be at the forefront of saying, no, the United States government or state government is not going to get into the business of determining what is disinformation, misinformation. Let's not go down that road. Now, is there a narrow space around hate speech, the things that we are, the exceptions to the First Amendment, right? Fighting words, hate speech. There's probably a narrow exception. If you go on your Facebook page and indicate you've got plans to kill somebody, maybe my argument falls in that case. But I regularly tell my constituents, don't look to us for the answer here because that comes with more negativity than you doing what you need to do as a citizen of a democracy, which is consciously develop the critical faculties that allow you to identify bias. I mean, Mike's right. There's a lot of bias in stuff, but I read the Wall Street Journal editorial page because I want to see that bias because otherwise, I'm just listening to you. But my point is that there is not going to be a policy solution except in the narrowest of alleys. And honestly, and I close my little rant here to my constituents, just saying, look, you're going to get the democracy that you want. If you see the critical act of being a citizen as entertainment, meaning you just read those 20 guys and you just love it or you hate it, you'll get the democracy you deserve. Soon it won't be a democracy, but if you don't take seriously the duty to reflect critically, we're collectively not going to deserve a democracy.
And I think,
I agree wholeheartedly with what Jim is saying. The other thing I would say, and I think it's important as elected officials, I go talk to every news outlet. I'll talk to the New York Times. I'll talk to MSNBC. I was on Morning Joe this morning. I'll go on Fox. I'll go on Newsmax. I'll go on CNN frequently. You have to be willing to engage the broader public and the broader conversation, and not just go where it's comfortable, or you may not get asked tough questions, or you may only be able to spew the talking points. You actually have to go where the public is. And coming from a district that Joe Biden won by 10 points as a Republican, where there's 70,000 more Democrats than Republicans, where Bill and Hillary Clinton are my constituents, I have to go talk to a broader population. Otherwise, I don't win my election. And so I think part of the challenge here is that a lot of members don't do that or aren't willing to do that anymore because it's just so confrontational. Everything is so theatrical. But you have to be willing to do that to change this narrative a bit.
And I mean, it's connected to this idea of you said robust debate. A part of robust debate is respectful debate. Mm-hmm. Hey, I think you're wrong about this. I don't think you're a bad human being, right? And it feels like we've often lost the ability to have that kind of debate, which is absolutely crucial to a democracy. A democracy is not a country where everybody agrees, right? It's sort of baked into the idea.
That's a totalitarian.
Yeah,
that's the
exactly.
definition of totalitarian.
That's the thing. Everybody says they don't want a totalitarian government. They don't want dictatorships, and then they're like offended that there may be an actual disagreement in the public discourse.
So let's talk about financial markets. Specifically, what kind of changes do you each want to see to our financial markets so that they serve ordinary Americans better? We'll go in reverse order.
I think we have an opportunity on democratization inside the markets, in giving people on Main Street the access that people have on Wall Street. That's easier said than done, right? So that's a simplistic phrase. How do you give people those access? I think we have to continue to look at avenues to make sure people have access into the markets. The other side is making sure that the capital is being distributed throughout the country. So not a heavy-handed approach, but looking at the regulatory barriers that are preventing those funds from coming into places like Southeast Wisconsin, rather than simply being concentrated in some of our nation's largest cities.
Or Greenwich. What do you want to? How do you want to see the financial markets change to serve people better?
First, it would be helpful to do something unnatural with 3 members of Congress, which is to let's have the real discussion rather than the partisan discussion. Because nothing brings up quite as much animus, frankly, on both sides of the aisle as political monikers like Wall Street, right? So let's start from what I think is a defendable premise, which is that we have the very best, most liquid, most capable, growth-oriented capital markets on the planet, bar none, by a long shot. And so, again, maybe in my party, the typical thing to do would be to start from a very different place from that, but that is a fact. So, but what? Let me outline. I was 12 years in the industry, so I will say this with some knowledge. I think there's at least 2 big problems. Number one, I think Bryan is exactly right. The availability of capital has a lot to do with geography and access. And I think there's all kinds of amazing businesses, not just in the rural Midwest, but in the Bronx, that don't get funded because there's no mechanism for capital to get to people who aren't connected or in certain geographies. Bryan covered that really well. I do think that the industry is beset by a lot of barriers to entry, oligopoly behavior, non-competitive behavior, everything from the way gross spreads are priced on IPOs. This is what is paid by young companies that want to go public. Lo and behold, they have been 7% for about the last 50 years, and they don't move from that. To the brand value of the JP Morgans and the Citibanks and the Goldman Sachses, that's a barrier to entry. I would like to see, as much as I benefited from a long time in one of those institutions, I would like to see the full brunt of disruptive innovation cut loose into the financial sector. Everything else has been disrupted. Media, medicine, well, not so much medicine, but media certainly has been disrupted. But this, Wall Street and the big banks have somehow been insulated from the competition and the innovation that I think would bring down pricing and make for a more competitive capital markets.
Yeah, Congressman Lawler.
So when you look at our economy, obviously small business is integral to it. And to the point, Bryan, I mean, access to capital is critical. And if they don't have access to capital, if these businesses cannot get the loans or the initial investments, that obviously makes it difficult for the economy to grow, for job creation, economic opportunity. That is what has set America apart from so much of the rest of the world, is that economic opportunity, and bringing people into the middle class. The unions have played a role in it as well. There's a broad swath of reasons why we've had so much success over the last century. But I think access to capital is critically important. I also, and I serve on the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, and I think housing is important. I don't agree with some of the policies that have been enacted in New York with respect to rent control. For instance, there's 50,000 vacant units in New York City. Now, there's a housing crisis in New York City, but there's 50,000 vacant units because of rent control and the fact that it costs more to upgrade the apartment and get it to code than you can charge on rent. And so they're taking the tax write-off instead. So we have to think about how we are actually enacting policies. There may be a well-intentioned policy, but if it's not working, we have to reevaluate that. So I think housing is critical with respect to our financial markets. And I think energy policy is critical. We've done a lot of work on ESG in this Congress, in committee. We've done a lot of work on data privacy, digital assets, and cap markets. That's been the main focus of the first 10 months or so. But there's a lot more work to do, and I think if we want an economy that is robust, that is growing, that is thriving, I would again reiterate it's the access to capital, it's housing, it's energy, and it's immigration policy.
So the deficit we've already talked about is a real problem, and it's going to become a bigger one as interest rates rise and the government has to pay those interest rates. When I look at the numbers, it seems pretty clear to me that the biggest budget items going forward are Social Security and healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid. And so it's really hard for me to see how we address our deficit problem without making some cuts to those programs. We can call them something other than cuts if that helps, adjustments, or increasing taxes. Do you disagree with that framing? I'll start with the Republican members.
Well, I would start with the other piece of the framing that I think is really important is economic growth.
Yep.
And so as you look at tax revenue, right, simply raising rates is one technique, and you may or may not end up with more revenue at the end of the day. The other is to grow the pie.
Yep.
And so I don't think you want to walk away not focused in on economic growth. And
Yep.
so if you go before we hit COVID, you saw economic growth increasing dramatically, and you saw wages increasing across the board above inflationary numbers. And as a result, federal tax revenue was increasing. That, I think, is a critical piece of the puzzle that can't be lost in the broader conversation, because you can't simply cut your way out of the problem. Then I think the other piece that is really important to look at inside the buckets that you're talking about, 25% or so of the federal budget is what we call discretionary spending, meaning Congress is appropriating it every year. 75% is on autopilot, the two biggest buckets you mentioned. The third bucket that is going to take up more and more of our time, I think was previewed by Congressman Himes, and that's interest payments on the debt. So interest payments on the debt are increasing dramatically as a result of higher interest rates. How long those higher interest rates stay will be a factor. But I think most people are looking at this and saying we're going to go from $450 billion a year now, just over a year ago, that was the year-end number, to north of 600 this year. In the not too distant future, we'll be at $1 trillion of interest payments on the debt. You don't get anything for that. And so I think that also needs to be a broader piece of the conversation. And then the final piece is people will reference cuts. I think we can also look in particular on the healthcare side as to how we deliver the ultimate product. So as we look at north of $1 trillion being spent on health insurance,
Yep.
I think you can maintain the standard of care being provided. In some ways, I think you can improve it. And you can look at efficiencies on how you deliver that product.
Yeah, many other countries figure out different ways to do it more efficiently than we do.
There's no question when you look at our national debt approaching $34 trillion that we have a crisis. When I was in high school, 20 years ago, our national debt was in the single digits. So in 20 years' time, it has exploded. Now there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's unsustainable. And I think when you look at revenue, tax revenue, we have the most tax revenue we've ever taken in. So it's not an issue of, hey, we don't have revenue. We do. We're just spending at rates that we cannot sustain. And a lot of that is driven by mandatory spending. Now, Social Security and Medicare are critically important programs, for our senior citizens and for our future. And we want to make sure that those programs are sustainable for the long term. If we do nothing right now, they're both going broke within the next decade. So if we leave it just as is, they will both be broke. And that is a fundamental problem that we have to address. As a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, one of the things we talked about during the debt ceiling negotiations and again during the lead up to the potential shutdown in September was this need for a debt commission. Both parties, it's a third rail. It is, the political third rail. I was getting attacked at the beginning of the year that I wanted to cut Social Security and I wanted to cut Medicare. Not true. Don't want to do that. Want to make sure they're both sustainable. And how do we deal with that for the long term? So both parties are going to need to be part of the solution on that. It cannot be a one-party solution. It's not going to work. Because it'll just be political and it'll turn into, a piñata. And it won't go anywhere. So it's got to be a joint effort here by both parties to deal with the long-term ramifications. Does that mean lifting the cap on the payroll tax? Does that mean raising the age for those that are, some of your age, 25 and younger? Maybe, but it's all got to be looked at, and it's got to be a joint effort, or it's never going to go anywhere.
Or potentially reducing benefits for higher income people. That's another option.
Means testing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of different options you can look at.
So, do you want to endorse Social Security or Medicare cuts or tax increases?
Well, put that way. So I've been through this once. I went through a debt commission once before in 2009, 2010.
Bowles-Simpson.
The Simpson-Bowles. And in 2009, the National Security Advisor, Admiral Mullen, said the single biggest strategic threat to the United States is the national debt. The national debt at the time was about $7 trillion, or about a third of where it is today. I'll come back to that because we have a huge cry wolf problem here, which isn't to say, by the way, everyone who says it's unsustainable, at some point they will be right. The question is when. But the point I'm making is that I went through a debt commission. I was one of 33 votes in a 435-person body in favor of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and I still get beat up for it. But we know with that as a model what is going to happen. This is politically brutal. It is mechanically not that hard. There will be reforms to Social Security and Medicare. There will be cuts to discretionary spending, and there will be new revenue. And yes, growth is important. The point is, if you're saying that any one of those three things are not on the table, you're not serious about the math. And you can go back and look at Simpson-Bowles. It's important that we start because this stuff is really hard with people really understanding what it is that we're talking about. The best one sentence to understand the federal government, which many of you have heard before, is if you want to understand the federal government, it is a social insurance program, Medicare and Social Security, guarded by a military. That is what the federal government does. So please don't talk to me about foreign aid, which is less than 1% of the budget, or food stamps, which is 0.7%. It is a social insurance program guarded by a military. That's where the vast bulk, by the way, interest, of course, is now becoming a meaningful thing. But all of that stuff is going to happen. The question is, when does the political will come together? I, over the many years, after seeing the Simpson-Bowles failure, have rolled around to the notion that sadly it's going to take a market signal to get us there, because that stuff is really, really hard. In the meantime, I wish we could focus on win-wins, right? So many people will know this. Medicare, of course, provides health insurance for people over the age of 65. It also pays for every single American to get dialysis, regardless of your income, to get dialysis. Dialysis is something that you generally need to get when you have diabetes in critical form. Much of that, if it's type 2, is preventable. It's preventable. And I forget the exact number, but it's something like $70 billion a year of dialysis in Medicare. It's preventable through things like nutritional counseling and hotspots where there isn't availability of healthy food. That as long as we're not, and we're not, as long as we're not going to be courageous about tax increases and adjustments to Social Security and Medicare, let's at least focus on these immense win-wins that will actually move the needle.
So we have only a few minutes left. I want to get to the sort of lightning round of topics. We were talking backstage about this fascinating class inversion of American politics. You've all seen it in different ways in your districts, in which people without college degrees have moved to the right and people with college degrees have moved to the left. So I'm going to ask each of the two parties a different version of this question. What is it that the Democrats could do that would make both of your lives harder to win back more working class votes? If you were advising the Democratic Party, which you're obviously not, what is it that they could do that actually, and then I'm going to do the same for you on Republicans. So basically, how does the Democratic Party most hurt itself with working class voters?
My hot take is looking at cost of living. If I go out and talk to 500 people anywhere in my district, it's going to be cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. They're going to use different terms for it. They're going to talk about different things. Right? Somebody's going to talk about what it costs to fill up their car with gas. Somebody's going to talk about childcare. Somebody's going to talk about housing. Somebody's going to talk about their children's education. If they go to Georgetown, you know what I mean. And as we go through that, each one of those is hitting people. And so if we're talking about, I think sometimes we see, in my view, this administration miss that as it relates to the impact that it's having on people.
So my district is just north of New York City. 50% of households in my district have a cop, a firefighter, or a veteran living in the household. 50% of adults in my district have a college degree or higher. So it's highly educated, yet working class, 65% white, 19% Latino, large Jewish community, one of the largest in the country. Diverse district. It's got different needs, different issues, different challenges. I won because I talked about affordability, public safety, and education. And I think where the Democratic Party has kind of lost its way with a lot of folks in maybe the blue-collar working class world, if you will, is the affordability. They don't care that they're increasing the cost of groceries or energy with some of the policies that are being enacted. The cost of housing gone up significantly. The challenges surrounding public safety and the failure to enforce the law. I think a lot of people who would consider themselves a little more common sense would just be like, you broke the law. Enforce the law.
Yeah.
So it's issues like that I think cut across the border crisis. People are looking going, seriously? Eric Adams is taking in over 100,000 migrants and then trying to ship them up into our community because he has nowhere else to put them. People are looking at these policies going, they don't make sense. And I think that's where there's a disconnect with kind of the working class person that the Democrats used to have a very strong handle on, especially because of organized labor.
And some of it is really in your face. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but you take the New York City subway or the Washington Metro and you just see people jumping the turnstile in ways you didn't a decade ago. And it's just right in your face. Wait a second, the rules don't apply to everybody. Right. Okay, so whether it's your district, a lot of college graduate professionals have moved away from the Republican Party. We see it in the suburbs of Phoenix. We see it in the suburbs of Atlanta. What could the Republican Party do to win back more of those college graduate professionals that it has lost over the last several years?
I think there's a very clear answer to this, and we've seen it now in multiple elections. And the very clear answer is, you framed the question differently to me. You said, what could the Democratic Party do to help you? So tell me again.
What could the Republican Party do?
To win back.
To win back the college graduate professionals.
Super clear answer. Turn around the approach you're taking with respect to women's reproductive rights and associated issues. Not these Republicans, but there are some, and there are certainly thinkers who say not only are we going to win on abortion, but we're going to reverse birth control availability, et cetera. That is unbelievably toxic. If they could find a way to learn from what happened in Kansas and Ohio, that would be a huge problem for us electorally. And the second thing, which I think is clear as day, is figure out some way to tamp down the MAGA stuff, because I'm here to tell you, from one of the wealthiest suburban districts on the planet, that is absolutely toxic.
And what is the MAGA stuff? It's Donald Trump personally, and it's the election denial?
It's all of the above. Yeah, it's certainly the election denial, which gets to people's fears about the foundation of our democracy. Yes, it's stylistic. You were talking about country club Republicans. Country club Republicans don't much like the President Trump's style. It's the dysfunctionality of that administration and stuff. So it's quite a witch's brew of stuff.
Yep.
But if they could get those two things right, my party be in a heck of a lot of trouble.
Last thing, let's talk about the Mideast, which is obviously such a terrible situation. And can you just each give us a brief sense of both how we should think about the next several weeks or months in Gaza and in Israel, and what you hope will happen out of all this?
It's always so hard to talk about what you would hope for in the Middle East, because inevitably it doesn't come to pass. I hope for a couple things. I hope we can do a lot better in this country around issues of moral clarity. I've been appalled, quite frankly, my own alma mater and the way too many universities, too many people, too many political parties have gotten the moral question wrong. And I think if you get the moral question wrong, it's hard to do the policy, whether that's being full-throated in your condemnation of a hideous terrorist attack, whether it's acknowledging that the Palestinians themselves have lived under immense suffering for a very long period of time. I wish we could get the moral thinking, the moral clarity better. Number two, my own view is that the Israelis have every right and should do all they can to eradicate Hamas. My hope is that they will do that in a way that doesn't create a larger problem. That's why the president is pushing for care and humanitarian aid, et cetera. And then finally, we could talk for hours on this issue, but this problem in particular will haunt future generations if the Israelis and the Palestinians chiefly, but the rest of the world doesn't get back to where we were 15 years ago, where there is some commitment to solving the underlying problem. In my own view, that's a two-state solution. In my own view, neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian leadership have been in any meaningful way committed to that idea for at least a decade. But, the idea that persisted in Israel for a long time, and I say this without any normative judgment whatsoever, that, the country would do fine, we would have a wall, and those 5 million-ish people, you don't need to think about them. You need to think about them. Yeah. And if we don't come up with a just and lasting solution, we will deal with this tragedy for another generation or two.
Congressman Steil.
Let me touch it in two parts. One, I think it's important that we're standing with Israel, giving them the resources they need to defend themselves to eradicate Hamas. Uniquely for this conversation, I think it's worthy of talking about the United States has the most substantive and robust capital markets, as Congressman Himes noted, also insurance markets as well. And so we're uniquely positioned as it relates to address sanctions and capital flows. And we have that liberty because we are the greatest capital markets in the world, bar none. And then leveraging those sanctions to try to drive forward U.S. foreign policy objectives and doing so thoughtfully. And there's two pieces here. One is putting forward the sanctions, but two is enforcing them. And so as we look at Iran as having being the largest state sponsor of terrorism around the globe, we continue to see Iran finding access to financial markets. I have concerns with what this administration is doing in that regards. But in particular, I think we could look at this as an opportunity to build and work with our allies to truly enforce many of our sanctions. So Iran right now is selling oil on the illicit market to Syria, to China, possibly other locations. I think we have an opportunity to look at that and really dive in on the financial markets. And just because of the setting for us today, I think the fact that the United States has the most robust capital markets gives us that luxury to do that. And I think it's imperative that we act upon that.
Congressman Lawler.
So I just came back from Israel on Monday. I was there Sunday with Chairman Mike McCall, Ranking Member Meeks, and a number of other members. And we met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We met with Defense Minister Gallant and U.S. Ambassador Jack Lew, as well as families of some of the hostages. And we watched a 21-minute video with the Prime Minister of the raw footage of the attacks on October 7th. And after watching that video, it reaffirmed my position that there cannot be a ceasefire. Hamas is a terrorist organization that has been funded and backed by Iran for decades. Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terror. Most of their money is derived by the sale of Iranian petroleum, which is why my bill, the SHIP Act, passed through the House last week to enact secondary sanctions on China, the biggest purchaser of Iranian petroleum. And we need to be very clear-eyed here. There is no moral equivalency. Hamas targeted innocent civilians, butchered, brutalized, raped, beheaded women, children, babies, and they did so with glee. And when you watch this 21-minute video, you see it. No one after 9/11 would have told the United States to engage in a ceasefire with al-Qaeda. So Israel has a right to defend itself. They have a right to defend their citizens. And I will not equivocate on that. Now, Hamas, on the other hand, has oppressed the Palestinian people. They are the governing body in Gaza. They have oppressed the Palestinian people. They have used these people as human shields. They have set up military operations in hospitals, in schools. And as Israel set up a corridor for Palestinians to move from the northern part of Gaza to the south, Hamas is shooting their own civilians that are trying to escape. The death toll that is being reported is not accurate. It includes the thousands of Hamas terrorists that have been killed. And so I think, number one, when we're dealing with this conflict right now, we need to be very clear on the facts and what is actually happening. And we need to understand the difference. Israel is not targeting innocent civilians. Israel is prosecuting a war in defense of its sovereignty. And there is a big difference. And so I agree with Bryan about the sanctions enforcement. That is critical, and that is something the United States can play an important role in. But we need to provide them with the aid, the $14.3 billion. And we need to work not only to get the hostages released, including 9 Americans who are being held, but we need to prevent Hezbollah and Iran from opening up new fronts in this war. And I think it is critical that we continue forward with the Abraham Accords and get Saudi Arabia to the table. Saudi Arabia is going to be critical when all is said and done here, not only normalizing relations with Israel, but ultimately in rebuilding Gaza, because when this is all done, Hamas will be no more.
Well, I could talk to the three of you for a lot longer and dig into all this and ask you things, but let me just end by thanking you for this discussion. You talked about robust debate, and I really appreciate the kind of discussion and really respectful engagement that you all did here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.